The night was thick with the scent of rain and wild earth. Above the endless forest, the blood moon hung heavy, casting a crimson glow through the skeletal branches. The air pulsed with a dark energy, an omen of something forbidden waiting to unfold. Cale moved like a phantom through the undergrowth, his golden eyes burning like molten fire in the darkness. He was a beast of the wild, a predator who had spent centuries hunting the creatures of the night. His bare feet barely made a sound against the damp leaves, his muscles tensed with primal strength. Tonight, something unnatural was calling to him, a scent unlike anything he had ever known. A whisper of silk, a flicker of movement. Then, pain. Lightning shot through his veins as fangs sank into his throat. Cold, piercing, lethal. But he did not fall. Cale's growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that could shatter bone. His hand clamped like iron around a delicate wrist, yanking the attacker away. The force sent her spinning through the air, but she landed effortlessly, the hem of her gown fluttering like mist before settling around her feet. Cale's breath came in slow, measured beats as he took in the creature before him. She stood bathed in moonlight, impossibly beautiful and unbearably deadly. Silver eyes met his with an otherworldly glow, framed by waves of dark hair that cascaded down her back. The moon kissed her porcelain skin, making her look like something out of an ancient dream, a dream that could kill. She licked her lips, red with his blood, and then she smiled. "You should be dead." Her voice was soft, a whispered melody that sent a forbidden thrill down his spine. Cale lifted a hand to his neck. The bite was there, but the wound was already closing. The venom that should have turned his blood to ice had done nothing. His eyes darkened. "Not a single drop of me is human." The vampire tilted her head, as if contemplating something delicious. "A werewolf," she murmured, stepping closer. Unhurried, fearless. "No wonder your blood burns like wildfire." Cale should have lunged for her throat, torn her apart like he had done to countless vampires before. But his body betrayed him. His instincts screamed danger, but something deeper, something darker, held him in place. A pull, a craving. His fingers flexed. He wanted to touch her, to hold her still, and make her shatter in his grasp. He had never wanted anything from a vampire except their destruction. But this one was different. She stopped just inches away, close enough that he could feel the coldness radiating from her skin. Her silver eyes flickered downward, lingering on his lips, then his chest, then lower. Her slow gaze was a challenge, a dare. "I wonder," she breathed. "What else about you is different?" The question coiled around him, taunting, sinful. A muscle in Cale's jaw ticked. His control was slipping, unraveling one slow thread at a time. Then he moved. In the blink of an eye, he had her caged against a tree, his hand braced beside her head, his body crowding into hers with suffocating heat. She didn't flinch. She didn't fight. She only smiled. Something about that wicked curve of her lips unnerved him more than her fangs. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he murmured, his voice a dangerous promise in the dark. She let out a breath of laughter, light as snowfall. "You tell me," she whispered, brushing a single icy finger down his chest. Cale's blood roared in his ears. His instincts warned him. This was not a woman he could break. But something deep inside him whispered back. Perhaps she was a woman who could break him. And that, more than anything, terrified him. Cale's heartbeat pounded like a war drum, but his face remained unreadable, a mask of control, despite the storm inside him. This woman was danger itself, wrapped in pale silk and moonlight. A predator with silver eyes and a cruel, knowing smile. Yet, he didn't step back. His body still caged her against the rough bark, their closeness igniting a tension thick enough to cut. The scent of her, cold as winter, laced with the metallic whisper of blood, should have repulsed him. Instead, it stirred something primal, something feral, something forbidden. Her fingers ghosted along his chest, tracing the ridges of muscle, the heat of his skin seeping into her frozen touch. "You're burning," she murmured, voice as smooth as flowing water, like fire trapped inside a man's flesh. Cal's jaw clenched. He refused to react, refused to give her the satisfaction of knowing how much she affected him. But she saw. Her smile deepened, dark amusement glinting in her gaze. "Do I unnerve you, Wolf?" Cal's lips curled, the sharp edge of his canines flashing in the dim light. "No," he said, voice thick with warning. "Liar," she whispered. Then she moved. With a speed too fast for mortal eyes, she twisted out of his hold, spinning like a ghostly wisp of smoke. Before he could react, she was behind him, her breath brushing his ear like a cold kiss. "You're strong," she purred, her fingers trailing down his back, slow and deliberate. "But I wonder, are you fast enough?" Cal turned sharply, but she was already gone, vanishing into the shadows like a phantom. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. A challenge. She wanted him to hunt her. Fine. With a flick of his wrist, Cal stripped off his shirt, the fabric dropping to the forest floor. His golden eyes blazed as he inhaled deeply, catching her scent, a haunting blend of night roses and death. Then he moved. Through the trees, over the fallen leaves, a blur of speed. Raw power coiled into motion. The chase had begun. The night air howled around him as he pursued, every muscle honed for the kill. He could hear her, feel her presence slipping through the darkness, always just out of reach. She was playing with him, and he would not allow it. Cal's lips curled into a wicked grin. Time to change the game. He stopped suddenly, listening. His breathing slowed, his body stilled, and the forest seemed to hold its breath with him. The trick wasn't speed, it was patience. And then, a shift in the air, a whisper of movement. Cal lunged. Before she could react, he was upon her, gripping her wrists, spinning her around, slamming her back against a tree. This time, he didn't let her slip away. She gasped softly, but not in fear. Her silver eyes gleamed, her lips parting just enough to reveal the wicked hint of fangs. "You caught me," she breathed, but there was no defeat in her voice, only something darkly delighted. Cal leaned in, his face mere inches from hers. His grip on her wrists tightened, holding her still, forcing her to feel his strength. "Did you really think you could run from me?" he murmured, his voice low, dangerous. Her lashes lowered, and she smiled. Slow, wicked, beautiful. "No," she admitted. "I was hoping you'd catch me." Something in his chest tightened, but he refused to name it. She was a vampire, his enemy. And yet, she fit too perfectly in his grasp. His thumb brushed against the inside of her wrist, where no pulse beat beneath her skin. Her lips parted just slightly, as if she could feel it anyway. Cal's eyes darkened. "This is dangerous," he warned. Her gaze flickered to his lips. "I know." And yet, neither of them let go. Cal should have let go, should have stepped back, but he didn't. Instead, he held her there, pinned against the tree, his grip firm, unyielding. The coolness of her skin seeped into his fingertips, a stark contrast to his own burning heat. She felt like ice beneath his touch, but her gaze was fire. The moonlight spilled through the trees, silvering the air between them. It cast an ethereal glow on her face, making her look even more otherworldly. A creature of the night, sculpted in darkness and temptation. "I can hear your heartbeat," she whispered, voice like a slow-moving river. "It's wild, unruly." Her fingers flexed under his hold, but she didn't try to escape. Cal smirked, though his breath was heavier than he'd like to admit. "And what does it tell you, vampire?" Her lips curled slightly. "That you like the chase more than you should." His grip tightened. She wasn't wrong. Everything about her. Asterisk, asterisk, the scent of blood lingering on her skin, the way her silver eyes caught the moonlight, the wicked way she smiled as if she could taste his restraint. Asterisk, asterisk, set his instincts aflame. A vampire. his enemy, his natural prey. And yet he wanted to devour her in ways that had nothing to do with war. A slow sigh escaped her lips, soft but taunting. "You're holding me like you don't know what to do with me." Cal's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what to do with her. His free hand moved, not in anger, not in violence, but in something far more dangerous. He brushed his fingers along her throat, tracing the delicate curve of her jaw, letting his warmth seep into her frozen skin. A shudder passed through her, so slight, so brief, he almost missed it. Almost. Her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, she looked at him not as a predator, but as a woman caught in the hands of something she couldn't quite control. Cale leaned in, his breath fanning against her ear. "Tell me, little vampire, do I unnerve you?" She exhaled, slow and measured. "No. Liar." He heard the shift in her breathing, the way her body tensed, as if she, too, was at war with something she couldn't name. Then, without warning, she moved. With a sharp twist, she freed herself from his grasp, not to run, but to strike. In the blink of an eye, she was behind him, her hands pressing against his back, her nails teasing over his skin. "You're strong," she mused, her voice a whisper of silk and shadows. "But strength isn't everything." Cale turned fast, too fast for a human. But she was faster. One moment she was inches away. The next, she was on the branch above him, perched like a goddess of the night, smirking, waiting, daring. His chest rose and fell with a restrained growl. She was playing with him again, testing him. Fine. He could play, too. In a blink, Cale leaped. The branch cracked under his weight, but before she could vanish into the night, he caught her. Their bodies collided midair, and this time, they fell together. Through the cold air, through the whispering leaves, until he twisted, landing on his feet, his arms locking around her. Their descent controlled but fierce. Her breath hitched. For the first time, he saw something rare in her gaze. Surprise. "Still think strength isn't everything," he murmured, voice laced with dark amusement. A pause. Then, a slow, dangerous smile. Her fingers curled against his bare chest, pressing just enough to remind him of what she was. "I think," she whispered, her lips brushing close to his jaw, "we're going to ruin each other." Cale smirked, his grip tightening around her waist. "Then let's not waste time." The forest was silent. Not the silence of peace, but of something far more primal. A waiting. A tension. Cale still held her, their bodies locked in a breathless standoff. The scent of night-blooming flowers mingled with the lingering trace of blood on her skin, a scent that sent fire through his veins. His instincts screamed at him to let go, to step back. But he didn't. Instead, his grip tightened, pulling her against him. Her body was cold, sculpted from moonlight and shadow, but he felt the faint tremor beneath her stillness. She was not as unaffected as she wanted him to believe. "I should kill you." Her voice was soft, but edged with something darker. It would be effortless. Cale smirked, his fingers trailing along the delicate line of her spine. "Then why haven't you?" Her breath hitched, so slight he almost missed it. Almost. Her silver eyes held his, sharp as the blade of a hunter who had never failed to strike. Yet, for all her power, she had not struck him down. "Tell me, little vampire," he murmured, his lips brushing just shy of her ear. "Are you hesitating?" Her fingers flexed against his chest. A warning. A threat. But she did not push him away. Then, slowly, deliberately, she moved. Her cold fingertips slid up his arm, tracing the ridges of muscle, stopping at the curve of his jaw. A single touch, and it sent a shudder through him. Not of weakness, but something deeper. Something dangerous. "I don't hesitate," she whispered. "I choose." And then, without warning, she struck. Her lips crashed against his neck, sharp fangs grazing, teasing, never breaking skin. A growl rumbled in Cal's chest, deep and raw, his own beast rising in answer. For a heartbeat, he let her play her game. Let her tempt him, taunt him, see how far she could push. Then, he turned the tide. With a swift movement, he twisted, pressing her against the rough bark of the tree, caging her beneath him. His body burned against hers, his heat consuming her icy coolness. She gasped, not in fear, but in something far more intoxicating. "You bite me," Cal rasped, "and I'll return the favor." A slow, wicked smile curved her lips. "Would you?" His fingers found her wrist, pinning it above her head. "Try me." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken hunger. Not just for blood, not just for dominance, but for something neither of them could name. She leaned in, her breath fanning against his throat. A test, a challenge. Cal's grip tightened. Their war was shifting. No longer predator and prey. No longer a battle of fangs and claws, but of something deeper, something neither of them had ever dared before. Her silver eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "You're a fool, werewolf." Cal smirked. "And you're stalling." She let out a soft, wicked laugh, a sound that sent a dark thrill through his chest. And then she vanished. A blur of motion, a whisper of cold air, and she was gone. Cal exhaled sharply, turning his gaze to the shadows where she had disappeared. She was fast, too fast, but she had left something behind. A game, a promise, and Cal had never been one to back down from a hunt. With a slow, knowing grin, he turned toward the darkness and followed. The wind carried her scent, sweet, dark, elusive. Cal stalked through the trees, his movements silent despite his size. His blood ran hot, his muscles coiled with anticipation. She had run. A taunt, a challenge. But she had left a trail. Faint impressions in the damp earth, the whisper of disturbed leaves, the lingering pulse of her presence in the night air. His lips curled into a slow, predatory grin. She wanted to be chased. Fine. But she would not outrun him. He moved swiftly, his body a blur of muscle and instinct, weaving through the shadows. His heartbeat thundered, steady, relentless. She was fast, but she was not running to escape. She was leading him deeper. The forest thickened, the silver glow of the moon filtering through the canopy in jagged beams. The air grew colder, the scent of damp earth mixing with something ancient, something forbidden. Then he saw her. She stood at the edge of a moonlit clearing, poised like a specter of the night. Her gown of midnight silk clung to her form, moving like liquid shadow. Silver hair cascaded down her back, catching the light in strands of ethereal beauty. Her lips, still stained with the taste of his defiance, curved into something that was not quite a smile. Waiting. Cal stepped forward, his approach unhurried. She had run, but he had caught her. "You let me find you," he murmured. She tilted her head, eyes gleaming like shattered starlight. "Did I?" His jaw tensed. Even now, she toyed with him. Even now, she held herself just beyond his grasp. But not for long. With a sudden burst of speed, Cal closed the distance between them. She moved just as swiftly, but he was prepared. His hand caught her wrist, cool, delicate, deceptively strong. He spun her, trapping her between himself and the ancient oak behind her. A sharp inhale. Not of fear, but something far more dangerous. His body pressed against hers, heat and strength caging her in. Her icy touch met his fire, a contrast that should not exist, yet somehow made the air between them crackle. Her free hand lifted, fingers grazing his jaw. A ghost of a touch. A promise. Cal growled low in his throat. It was not submission. It was something else entirely. "You're playing with fire, little vampire," he whispered. She smiled then, slow and knowing. "And you're not." His grip on her wrist loosened, but he did not step away. He wouldn't. Her pulse, if she had one, was unreadable, but he felt her hesitation, the smallest fraction of uncertainty. Cale leaned in, his breath warm against the curve of her throat. "Why did you run?" For the first time, she did not answer immediately. Her gaze searched his, something unreadable flickering in their silver depths. And then, softer than the wind through the trees, she whispered, "Because I wanted to see if you'd follow." A slow exhale left Cale's lips. This game they played, this war of hunger and restraint, was spiraling into something neither could control, something neither of them wanted to stop. His fingers brushed against her jaw, tilting her chin upward. "I always will." A silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then, as if testing fate itself, she rose onto her toes, her lips a breath away from his. A heartbeat. A choice. And then, she disappeared again. Cale let out a dark chuckle, shaking his head as he stared at the empty space where she had stood. She was running. But this time, he knew exactly how this hunt would end. And so, with a knowing smirk, Cale followed. Cale moved like the night itself, swift, relentless, unstoppable. The forest was her domain, but the hunt belonged to him. Every rustle of the leaves, every whisper of wind through the trees carried her presence. She thought she could run. She wanted him to chase her. He would devour her. A flicker of movement, a shadow shifting in the moonlight. There, Cale lunged, the force of his movement tearing through the silence. He struck with inhuman speed, his body crashing against hers, sending them both tumbling onto the moss-covered earth. A gasp escaped her lips as she landed beneath him, her silver hair fanning out like spilled moonlight. Caught. His hands pressed against either side of her head, his body hovering over hers. Trapped between the earth and the storm of him, she had nowhere to run. Her chest rose and fell, the weight of his presence pressing into her like a force of nature. Her lips parted, and for the first time, there was no smirk, no teasing challenge. Only silence. Cale's golden eyes burned as they roamed over her, the sharp angles of her face, the impossibly soft curve of her mouth. He could feel her stillness, the tension beneath the surface, like a predator trying not to flinch in the jaws of something greater. She was deadly, and yet, so fragile beneath his hands. A dangerous thing, caged beneath a more dangerous beast. "You ran," he murmured, his voice rough. Her silver eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "And you followed." Cale's breath came heavy, his pulse wild. "I always will." He meant it. It wasn't a game anymore. It had never been. His hand moved before he could stop himself, tracing the delicate line of her throat. She did not need to breathe, and yet, he swore he could feel the echo of something there. A heartbeat that did not exist, a life she was never meant to have. Her lips parted, and for a fraction of a second, he thought she would yield. But instead she whispered, "Do you know what you've done?" Cale stilled. Something shifted. The hunger in her gaze darkened, deepened, not just for blood, but for something far more dangerous. She moved, not to escape, but to rise. Like a blade slipping between ribs, her slender fingers traced up his chest. Her cool touch met his fire, sending a shudder through his body. She was looking at him differently now. Not as prey, not as a mistake, but as something forbidden. Cale exhaled sharply as she lifted herself, their faces so close that he could taste the winter on her breath. "You shouldn't have chased me," she murmured. His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have run." A sharp, knowing smile curved her lips. "Then what will you do now, Wolf?" she whispered. "Now that you've caught me." Cale felt the weight of her words settle into his bones. Now, it was too late. Too late to stop. Too late to turn away. Too late to pretend he didn't crave her. A deep growl rumbled from his chest as his fingers curled into the earth beside her. He was fire, she was ice, and somewhere between them, something impossible burned. Something forbidden. Something inevitable. But before either of them could speak, A sound shattered the night. Distant, low, menacing. Not from him. Not from her. Cal's head snapped up, his sharp senses locking onto the disturbance. Something else was coming. Something that did not want them to exist. And just like that, the hunt was no longer a game. A low growl rippled through Cal's chest as he lifted his head, his golden eyes scanning the shadows. Something lurked beyond the trees. Watching. Waiting. Celine heard it too, her delicate fingers tensed against his chest, her silver eyes sharpening with knowing. "They found us," she murmured. Cal didn't need to ask who they were. His kind. Her kind. Both. The world had no place for a union like theirs. A werewolf and a vampire. Two warring beasts bound by something neither could explain. He should have pulled away. He should have left her. But he couldn't. Cal rose, his form towering over her as he reached down. "Come." Celine hesitated, the moonlight catching the sharp contours of her face. A queen of the night, elegant, untouchable. But now, caught between war and something far more dangerous. A choice. Her pale fingers slid into his larger hand. Cold against heat, death against life. And together, they ran. The forest blurred around them as Cal led her deeper into the wild. Branches snapped beneath his stride, the wind howling as if warning them to turn back. But there was no turning back. Not now. Celine moved beside him, her speed effortless, her form a phantom in the dark. Yet for all her grace, for all her strength, he could feel it. The hesitation. The war within her. "You're afraid," Cal growled as they reached a clearing. The sky above them, a stretch of endless black. Celine pulled away, her silver gaze unreadable. "You should be too." Cal took a step forward. She took a step back. His jaw tightened. "What are you running from, Celine?" Her lips parted, but no words came. The air between them burned with unspoken things. Things too fragile to name, too dangerous to be real. Then she whispered, "This." Cal's breath hitched as her cold fingers traced the line of his jaw. A touch that should not exist, a moment that should never have happened. Yet here they were. His grip tightened around her wrist, holding her still. "You knew this would happen." A sharp breath, a heartbeat of silence. "Yes," she admitted. "And so did you." Cal's pulse roared. This war, this fate, they had both been born into it. They were enemies, bound by blood, by laws that had existed long before them. But none of that mattered now. Not when she was standing before him, fire in her gaze, ice on her skin, and something else. Something broken, something raw, burning between them. Cal's fingers tangled in her silver hair, tilting her head back. She didn't resist. She never did. "You bite me," he murmured, voice dark. "It won't kill me." Celine's breath was shaky, uncertain. "But it will change you." "I'm already changed," he growled. "Because of her. Because of this." Her hand pressed against his chest, and for the first time, he swore he felt something beat beneath her palm. Not a heart, not truly, but something just as real, something just as damning. Celine shuddered, her lips parting as if to protest. But then the night shattered. A furious howl, a shriek of warning. They were here. Cal turned sharply, his instincts flaring, his body shifting toward the coming storm. The hunters, the executioners. Celine's fingers tightened around his. One last glance, one last choice, and then chaos. The night roared alive with the sounds of battle. Cal spun, teeth bared, muscles coiled like a beast on cage. Shadows broke through the trees. His kind, their kind, a force sent to rip him from her. Celine stood at his side, her silver eyes burning like dying stars. She had been trained for this, sculpted into a weapon by centuries of war. Yet, for the first time, she hesitated. Because to fight them meant to forsake her own. Because to stand with him meant she could never go back. Cal growled low, his hands flexing into claws. "Stay behind me." But Celine's cold fingers brushed his arm. "I was never behind you, Wolf." Then she struck first. A flash of motion, deadly, elegant, irresistible. She moved through the attackers like mist, her body a whisper of white silk and shadow. Her fangs sank into a throat. Her hand snapped a wrist, and for every step forward Cale took, she was already there, matching his violence with her own. She was breathtaking. His own kind lunged at him, but Cale was a force of nature. He tore through flesh, shattered bones, the taste of blood copper-sweet on his tongue. Yet, for all his power, for all his rage, he knew they were outnumbered. Celine knew it too. Her breath came fast as she landed beside him, their enemies circling like vultures. She turned to him, her lips stained with blood, her beauty sharpened by the chaos. "Run," she whispered. Cale let out a low, dangerous laugh. "You really don't know me at all." The next wave came. Pain, teeth, claws. A blade slashed across Cale's chest, but he barely felt it. His body burned, shifting, his wolf howling inside him. Celine was there, fighting, fierce and fearless, but they were pushing her back. A warlord's hand caught her wrist. A strike sent her to her knees. Cale's world went black with fury. His snarl ripped through the night. The air itself seemed to tremble as he moved, faster, deadlier than before. His claws raked through flesh, his fangs crushed bone, and he reached for her. But they dragged her away. Celine twisted, struggling, her silver gaze locking onto his. Cale lunged, but a dozen hands pulled him back. Chains snapped around his arms, his throat. Celine let out a sound he had never heard before. Not rage, not defiance. Desperation. "Cale." Her voice cracked something inside him. He thrashed, every muscle in his body screaming to break free. But there were too many. Celine was fading into the dark, her captors dragging her into the abyss. And he was falling. Falling into silence. Falling into nothing. Dawn came like a wound across the sky. Cale awoke in a cage of steel, his body wrecked, his mind a storm. The scent of her was gone. He staggered forward, the silver shackles burning into his wrists, his heart an empty thing in his chest. Celine was gone, taken, and for the first time in his cursed life, Cale knew what true hunger felt like. Not for blood, not for war, but for her. The world thought they could tear her from him. They were wrong.